You know, there are some stories that cross your screen and you have to read them 3 times just to make sure you're not dreaming. This is one of those stories. A teacher, an educator, shot by police for honking their horn. And now whispers of a cover-up are starting to leak out like smoke from a hidden fire. It sounds like the plot of a movie set in a dystopian future, doesn't it? But this isn't a movie. This is allegedly happening in the United States of America, and I need you to sit down for this one because the details are as disturbing as they are confusing. Before we dive into the weeds of this specific incident, and trust me, we are going to pull every single thread until the whole sweater unravels, I have to ask you something, and I want you to really think about it. If you were sitting in your car, minding your own business, and you tapped your horn because the car in front of you was sitting at a green light, and suddenly you found a police officer pointing a gun at your face, what would be going through your mind? What would you do in that split second where your instinct to survive clashes with your disbelief that this is actually happening? I really want to know your thoughts on this, so drop that in the comments. Tell me what you think the average person's reaction should be, or what you fear your reaction might be. Because the way we answer that question tells us a lot about the world we think we live in versus the world we actually live in. And stick with me, because what we've uncovered about the legal ins and outs of this situation might just save your life one day, or at the very least, keep you out of an orange jumpsuit. Let's set the scene, because context is everything. We aren't talking about some high-speed chase where a teacher was running from the law after committing an armed robbery. We are talking about a traffic situation, a horn, that little noisemaker in the middle of your steering wheel that we use to say, hello, goodbye, watch out, or, hey, the light is green, let's go. It is probably the most used and least thought about feature in any vehicle. But in this case, that simple beep became the centerpiece of a major use of force incident. Now, I haven't been in that specific car, and you haven't either, but we have all been in traffic. We have all felt that flash of frustration when someone is staring at their phone instead of the asphalt in front of them. For a teacher, maybe they were running late to pick up their own kids, maybe they had a stack of papers to grade at home, or maybe they just had a long day of dealing with 25 energetic children and they wanted to get to their driveway. So they tapped the horn, a brief, polite reminder that civilization is waiting on them. And then suddenly, blue lights in the rearview mirror. This is where the story takes a hard turn into the bizarre. According to the claims being made, the interaction didn't stay a simple traffic stop for long. It escalated, and it escalated fast. We are hearing that the teacher was shot by law enforcement for honking. Now, if that doesn't raise every hair on the back of your neck, you haven't been paying attention to the state of policing in this country. I've spent a lot of time researching how these encounters go down, and I've spoken to enough people to know that there is a massive difference between how things are supposed to go and how they actually go in the heat of the moment. In a perfect world, an officer walks up to the window, asks for license and registration, maybe asks why the horn was used, and everyone goes on their merry way. But we don't live in a perfect world. We live in a world where everyone is on edge, where the person in the car could be having the worst day of their life, and where the officer approaching the vehicle might have already decided, consciously or not, that this stop is a threat. What makes this case particularly volatile is the accusation of a cover-up. You see this a lot, and it's something I always warn travelers and drivers about. The initial police report is a narrative. It is a story written by one side immediately after the event, when the adrenaline is pumping and the officer is, understandably, trying to justify their actions. But when that narrative doesn't match the video evidence, or the witness statements, or basic common sense, the public starts to ask questions. And when the answers don't come, or when they change, that's when you hear the word cover-up. The claim here is that the authorities are trying to spin this as something other than what it was. Maybe they're saying the teacher was acting erratically. Maybe they're saying the teacher reached for something. Maybe they're saying the horn was just the catalyst for a deeper investigation into the teacher's mental state. But if you are a teacher, a neighbor, a friend of this person, and you know they were as stable as a rock, you start to smell a rat. And that smell of a rat is what keeps people glued to this story. Now, I want to take a step back here and talk about something that I think is vital for every single person who watches my content to understand. The Constitution does not stop working just because you are in a car. I know we sometimes treat our vehicles like extensions of our living rooms, and legally, they kind of are. You have rights in that metal box. But the moment you are stopped by law enforcement, a very specific dance begins. And if you don't know the steps, you can trip. And in this case, tripping allegedly led to a teacher being shot. Let's talk about that initial moment, the stop. For a traffic violation, and yes, in some jurisdictions, excessive or unnecessary honking can actually be cited as a noise violation, though it's rare. The officer has the right to pull you over. That's legal. They have probable cause that a violation occurred. You see the lights, you pull over. So far, so good. Now, here is where your rights kick in, and this is the part I want you to tattoo on the inside of your brain. You have to provide your license, your registration, and proof of insurance. That's it. Those three things. You do not have to answer the question, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" You do not have to answer, "Where are you coming from?" You do not have to answer, "Have you been drinking?" People get this wrong all the time. They think they have to be chatty. They think they have to be helpful. They think if they are nice, the officer will let them off with a warning. That might work sometimes, but it also opens the door to you accidentally saying something incriminating. In this teacher's case, if they were simply asked about the horn, the safest, most constitutional response is to hand over the documents and remain silent. But I know and you know that in the real world, that feels impossible. It feels rude. It feels confrontational. But the Fifth Amendment is there for a reason. It is your right to remain silent. You cannot be punished for simply refusing to answer a question. However, and this is a big however, in some states, you are required to give your name if asked. But beyond that, zip. Nada. Now here's where the situation allegedly went from a stop to a shooting. We have to assume that something happened that made the officer feel threatened, or we have to assume that the officer was wrong. The officer's legal ability to escalate the situation hinges on something called reasonable suspicion that a crime has been or is about to be committed, or that the suspect is armed and dangerous. If the teacher simply honked and then sat there compliantly, where does the reasonable suspicion come from? It doesn't. It evaporates. But let's play the devil's advocate for a second. Let's say the teacher, frustrated by being pulled over for a honk, started arguing. Let's say the teacher, feeling that this was a massive overreach of authority, started waving their hands. To an officer, that hand-waving could be perceived as a threat. It could be perceived as the prelude to reaching for a weapon, reaching for the glove box, reaching for something under the seat. The officer might then order the teacher out of the car. Under the law, an officer can order you out of the vehicle during a traffic stop for their safety. That is legal. Once you are out of the car, if the officer has a reasonable belief that you are armed, they can pat you down. This is the famous Terry frisk. But a pat-down is just that, a pat-down. It is not a license to go rooting around in your pockets or to escalate to lethal force unless they feel a weapon. So, for a shooting to be legally justified, the officer would have to articulate that they saw a weapon, or that the teacher made a move that suggested they were about to use a weapon against the officer. The cover-up aspect comes into play when the official story changes. Maybe the initial report said the teacher was combative. Then, later, body camera footage shows the teacher was simply holding their phone. Maybe the report said the teacher lunged at the officer, but witnesses say the teacher was backing away. This is where the public's trust in the system breaks down, and once that trust is broken, it is almost impossible to repair. I remember talking to a friend of mine who is a retired cop, and he told me something that has always stuck with me. He said, "The worst sound you can hear is the sound of your own heartbeat when you think you're about to die." And that's true for both the officer and the citizen. In a traffic stop, the officer is approaching a dark car with a person they know nothing about. That officer's adrenaline is spiking. Meanwhile, the driver is sitting there, their own adrenaline spiking because they have a uniformed authority figure walking up to them. It is a cocktail of fear and tension that can explode in a second. But, and this is a massive but, that fear does not justify a cover-up. If an officer makes a mistake, if they misread a situation and use deadly force when it wasn't warranted, the system is supposed to be transparent about it. We are supposed to have investigations, trials, and justice. When the system closes ranks, when the body camera malfunctions, when witnesses are intimidated, that is when the situation goes from a tragedy to a scandal. This teacher's story is resonating with people because it taps into a primal fear. We all drive. We all get frustrated. We all have used our horn. The idea that such a mundane act could lead to you being shot and then have the official machinery try to paint you as the aggressor is terrifying. It makes you wonder if the rules of society are just suggestions for some and ironclad laws for others. And look, I'm not here to bash every police officer. I've met some incredible ones who are true public servants. But the institution, the way it handles these high-profile incidents, often leaves a lot to be desired. The blue wall of silence is a real thing, whether we want to admit it or not. It's that unspoken code that you don't turn on your own. And while that might protect officers from false accusations, it also protects the bad actors who give the good ones a bad name. If these cover-up claims are true, it means that somewhere in a police department, there are people sitting in a room looking at evidence that tells one story and then writing a report that tells another. They are banking on the public being too distracted, too busy, or too cynical to fight back. They are banking on the fact that the teacher, recovering in a hospital bed, doesn't have the resources to fight City Hall. But that's where we come in. That's where the court of public opinion comes in. And that's why stories like this, when they are verified, have to be shouted from the rooftops. Let's think about the aftermath for a second, because this is something I always tell travelers to consider. If you find yourself in a situation where you are detained or arrested, you have specific rights. You have the right to a lawyer, you have the right to remain silent, you have the right to make a phone call. But if you are shot, your first call is to 911 for an ambulance. Your second call should be to a lawyer, not your spouse, not your mom, not your best friend, a lawyer. Because from the moment that trigger is pulled, a legal war has started. The police are gathering evidence, and they are gathering statements. You need someone in your corner who knows the rules of that war. In the context of an airport or a border, these rules shift slightly. At an airport, the TSA can detain you, but they can't arrest you. They have to call local law enforcement for that. And at the border, the rules are even more lax for the government. The Fourth Amendment's protection against warrantless searches is weaker within 100 miles of the border. Customs and Border Protection officers have a lot of latitude to search your belongings, your car, and even your electronic devices. If you are a non-citizen, refusing to answer questions at the border can actually result in you being denied entry. It's a completely different ballgame. But back to our teacher. This happened on American soil, on a public road, so the full weight of the Constitution should apply. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. Shooting someone is the ultimate seizure. It is the seizure of their life, their health, their future. For it to be reasonable, the threat has to be imminent and serious. Honking a horn does not meet that bar. Arguing does not meet that bar. Even cursing at an officer, while ill-advised, does not meet that bar for deadly force. The Supreme Court has weighed in on these matters many times. The standard is objective reasonableness. Would another reasonable officer in the same situation, with the same information, believe that deadly force was necessary? That is the question a jury would have to answer, and if the cover-up claims are true, it suggests that the officers involved know that their actions wouldn't pass that test, so they are trying to change the test. They are trying to change the narrative to make themselves look reasonable. This is why we need to be vigilant. This is why we need to pay attention to local news, to support independent journalism, and to hold our elected officials accountable. The police answer to the city government answers to the mayor, and the mayor answers to the voters. That is the chain. If the chain is broken, we have to fix it. I also want to touch on something that doesn't get talked about enough: the psychological impact on the teacher. Let's say they survive. Let's say they recover physically. They will carry that moment with them forever. The sound of the gunshot, the feeling of impact, the sight of the officer's face. They will have to live with the knowledge that their government, the people sworn to protect them, tried to end them. That is a trauma that doesn't heal. And if the cover-up is successful, they will also have to live with the knowledge that the world thinks they deserved it, that they were the aggressor, that they brought it on themselves by honking a horn. That is a heavy burden, and it's a burden that no one should have to bear. We have to ask ourselves as a society, is this the kind of place we want to live? Do we want to live in a place where a traffic dispute can end in a hail of bullets and a subsequent smear campaign against the victim? Or do we want to live in a place where we value life, where we value due process, and where we value the truth? Now, I know some of you are probably thinking, well, we don't know the whole story. And you are right, we don't. That is the point of an investigation. But when the people doing the investigating are the same people who employ the shooter, we have a conflict of interest. That is why we need independent oversight. That is why we need district attorneys who are willing to stand up to police unions. That is why we need cameras everywhere, because the truth is the only thing that sets everyone free. I was reading through some legal guidelines recently, and one thing that jumped out at me is how differently things are handled depending on where you are. For instance, if you are in an airport and you are suspected of a crime, the local police have to have probable cause to arrest you. But if you are just walking through the terminal and an officer approaches you for a consensual encounter, you have the absolute right to say, "I don't want to talk to you," and walk away. Most people don't know that. They think if a cop talks to them, they have to answer. You don't, not unless you are detained. And how do you know if you are detained? You ask. You say, "Am I free to leave?" If they say yes, leave. If they say no, then you are detained and they need reasonable suspicion. It's that simple. But in the heat of the moment, with lights flashing and adrenaline pumping, it's hard to remember these scripts. That's why I always tell people to practice. Say it in your head. I am exercising my right to remain silent. I am exercising my right to an attorney. Practice it until it becomes automatic. In the case of the teacher, we don't know if they had a chance to say anything. We don't know if the encounter went from 0 to 60 in the blink of an eye. But the fact that we are even talking about a cover-up means that whatever happened, the official version doesn't pass the smell test. And when the official version doesn't pass the smell test, it's up to the public to demand answers. There is a federal statute that allows the FBI to get involved in violent crimes against travelers. Now, technically, this teacher was probably a traveler in the sense that they were commuting, moving from point A to point B. But that statute is usually reserved for things like highway violence, not necessarily police shootings. Still, it shows that the federal government has a mechanism to step in when local authorities can't or won't handle things properly. Maybe that is what needs to happen here. Maybe we need a federal investigation to get to the bottom of it because the local department has proven they can't be trusted. I've spent years studying how systems work, and one thing I know for sure is that systems are made up of people. And people are fallible. They have biases. They have bad days. They have egos. When you put a gun and a badge on a fallible person, you are gambling with someone else's life. That is why training is so important. That is why de-escalation is so important. That is why we need officers who see themselves as guardians, not warriors. If this teacher was shot for honking, it represents a catastrophic failure of de-escalation. Somewhere along the line, an officer decided that the only way to handle a minor annoyance was with extreme violence. And that decision has now rippled out, affecting the teacher's family, the officer's family, and the entire community. It erodes trust. It makes people afraid. It makes people angry. And angry, afraid people don't make good decisions. I want to read you something that really puts this in perspective. According to the ACLU, if you are stopped by police, you have the right to remain silent, you have the right to refuse consent to a search, and if you are not under arrest, you have the right to calmly leave. These are not suggestions. These are your rights. But exercising them requires a level of composure that most of us don't have when we are staring down the barrel of a gun. So what do? We prepare, we talk to our kids about it, we talk to our spouses about it, we role play. I know it sounds silly, but it's not. It's survival. You need to know, in your gut, that when the officer asks to search your car, you have the right to say, "Officer, I do not consent to searches." You need to know that you can say that without being afraid that it will make things worse. It might make things worse with a bad cop, but it preserves your rights for the courtroom later. In this teacher's case, maybe they consented to something. Maybe they let the officer get too close. Maybe they opened the door when they shouldn't have. We don't know, but we do know that the outcome was catastrophic, and we owe it to them and to ourselves to figure out why. The shocking cover-up claims part of this story is what really gets the blood boiling, because a cover-up implies intent. It implies that people sat down and made a conscious decision to hide the truth. That is a crime in itself. Obstruction of justice is a crime. Perjury is a crime. If it turns out that reports were falsified, that evidence was destroyed, or that witnesses were silenced, then the people responsible need to go to jail. Not just the shooter, but the supervisors, the chiefs, the politicians who signed off on it. I've seen this play out in other cases. A high-profile incident happens, the department goes into lockdown mode, and then a few weeks later, a report comes out exonerating everyone involved. And the public is left scratching their heads, wondering how the video they saw on YouTube doesn't match the official narrative. It's infuriating. And it's un-American. We are supposed to be a nation of laws, not men. We are supposed to believe in transparency and accountability. When those things go out the window, we are left with nothing but power. And power, unchecked, always corrupts. So as we dig deeper into this story in the coming days and weeks, keep your eyes open. Look for the body camera footage. Look for independent witnesses. Look for statements from the teacher's family. And most importantly, keep asking questions. Don't let this fade into the background noise of the news cycle. This matters. This could be you. This could be your brother, your sister, your parent. Imagine for a second that it was your mom who drives carefully, who pays her taxes, who volunteers at the local library. She honks at someone at a light, gets pulled over, and ends up in the hospital with a gunshot wound. And then the police department starts leaking stories that she was erratic and uncooperative. How would you feel? What would you do? You would fight, you would scream, you would do whatever it took to clear her name. That is the energy we need to bring to these situations. Not violence, not hatred, but a relentless pursuit of the truth. We need to support the families. We need to show up at city council meetings. We need to vote for district attorneys who promise transparency. We need to make it politically dangerous to cover up police misconduct. Because at the end of the day, the only thing standing between us and chaos is the rule of law. And if the people who are supposed to enforce the law are above the law, then we have nothing. Now I want to circle back to that original question I asked you. If you were that teacher in that car and you saw that officer approaching with their hand on their holster, what would you do? Would you sit perfectly still, hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead? Would you try to explain yourself? Would you reach for your phone to start recording? The answer is complicated, and it depends on a million variables. But the safest thing, the thing that most legal experts will tell you, is to be as boring and predictable as possible. Keep your hands visible. Make no sudden movements. If you need to reach for your license, tell them what you are doing first. Officer, my license is in my back pocket. I'm going to reach for it now. It's demeaning, in a way. It feels like you are groveling, but it's also smart. It reduces the chance of a misunderstanding. And in a situation where misunderstandings can be fatal, being smart is better than being right. The tragedy of the teacher shot for honking is that it probably started with a misunderstanding. The officer misunderstood the horn. Maybe they thought it was directed at them. Maybe they thought it was a sign of aggression. And then the situation spiraled. And now, with the cover-up claims, the department is misunderstanding the public's demand for accountability. We have to hope that the truth comes out. We have to hope that justice is served, but hope is not a strategy. Action is. So do me a favor, share this story, talk about it, keep it alive, and if you have any information, any at all, about this case or others like it, don't keep it to yourself. Send it to someone who can do something with it. We are in this together. We are the checks and balances. We are the ones who have to make sure that when a teacher is shot for honking a horn, the world stops and takes notice. Because if we don't, who will? I've been doing this for a long time, and I can tell you that the patterns are always the same. A shocking event happens. The authorities release a statement that doesn't quite add up. The public gets angry. The authorities circle the wagons. And then, unless there is sustained pressure, the story dies. We can't let this one die. We have to keep pushing, keep asking, keep demanding. Think about the message it sends if we let this slide. It sends a message to every police officer that they can shoot first and ask questions later, and as long as they stick together, nothing will happen. It sends a message to every citizen that your life can be taken for a minor infraction, and the system will blame you for it. That is not the America I want to live in. That is not the America our founders envisioned. Our founders were rebels against a government they saw as oppressive. They believed in the right to protest, the right to bear arms, the right to a trial by jury. They believed that the government should fear the people, not the other way around. Somewhere along the way, we lost that. We started fearing the badge. We started believing that cops are always right. We started accepting that he shouldn't have resisted is a valid excuse for murder. It's not. It never was, and it never will be. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, and believe me, this is just the beginning of the conversation, I want you to hold on to that fire. Hold on to that sense of injustice. Use it to fuel your curiosity. Use it to fuel your activism. And use it to remind yourself that your rights are worth fighting for. And please, please share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what you would do in that situation. Tell me if you've ever had a close call. Tell me if you trust your local police department. Let's get a conversation going. Because the more we talk about this, the harder it is for the truth to stay hidden. We'll be watching this story closely, and as soon as any new information comes to light, especially if it confirms or debunks these cover-up claims, I'll be back to break it down for you. Until then, stay safe out there. Keep your hands on the wheel and your wits about you. And remember, sometimes the loudest statement you can make is silence. This response is AI-generated for reference only.